إنما هو التوحيد وتوحيد العبادة بالذات.
What exactly is an isnad? Most of us, again, know about the hadith. We always talk about hadith and sunnah. But here we have to get into the particular historical issue of how this knowledge is transmitted. How do we know Muhammad made a hijrah? How do we know there was a battle of Badr? What are the details of this? Okay. So all of this information. So it's a very basic question. How do we know what actually happened? And this is something that, of course, understood by the Sahaba, experienced by the Sahaba, but Muslims of the later period, as we'll see, also engage in this very issue. How do we know what is true? How do we know what hadith, what narrations, what stories about Muhammad and his companions, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum? How do we know that this is true? And as we'll see later on, much of the work of the muhaddithun, of the hadith scholars, is going to be sifting through literally tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of reports, most of which are fabricated or weak reports. So as we look at this issue, and later on get into the details of what we're talking about in the collection of the hadith, we have to keep this in mind. For the Muslims, and by comparison, at least in the modern period today, many Western scholars are also in agreement that the Quran that we're reading today is the Quran that was recited by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even though the early written manuscripts, written documents, are hard to come by. Very recently, there's been some discoveries of ancient manuscripts. We know there were discoveries in southern Arabia and Yemen just a couple of decades ago. More recently, in Birmingham Library in England, an ancient manuscript was discovered. So we know that the Quran was written down very early. According to Muslim traditions and beliefs, it was compiled, led by Zayd ibn Thabit, and presented to Uthman, the third caliph, and that this Quran was established. It was accepted by the Muslims. There was a little bit of dispute among some of the companions, such as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who had a slightly different version of the Quran. But by and large, within the period of the rightly guided caliphs, the Khulafa Rashidun, we have the Quran well established and fully agreed upon by the Sahaba that this is the recitation of Muhammad ﷺ, and that this Quran goes with the Muslims as they expand outside of Arabia. This is an important issue also as we look at this history, the expansion of the Muslims during the period of the Khulafa Rashidun. Historically, an unprecedented expansion. Eastward into Persia, north into Iraq, Syria, westward into Egypt and North Africa, all within 2 or 3 decades. This massive expansion. And this Quran goes with the Muslims everywhere they go. So that's why whether you're in North Africa or you're in Central Asia or beyond, it's the exact same Quran. With the exception of some minor disputes, and we know about the 7 different readings that are allowable, so you have some little variations, but the Quran as we have it is very well established early on. When we get to the Hadith, this is a different issue. Muslim scholars from early on have recognized this, and the deep, intense study of the Hadith is a major aspect of the Islamic sciences. The ulum al-din, all the sciences that make up Islam, and then you get to the ulum al-hadith, and the sciences of the hadith, because the transmission of the hadith the collection of the hadith and the authentication of the hadith is a different process. It wasn't simple and easy as with the Quran. And again, this would be from the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why He established the transmission of the Sunnah of Muhammad in such a different fashion. So the Quran is presented, it's known, recorded, and transmitted intact. But with the hadith, we have to go through a very complex process over several generations. So when Bukhari, and when Muslim, and when Abu Dawud and others compile these books, they are representing you might say, the end of a long process. Anyway, we'll get to that in more detail here. I want to cover the basic definitions, get some basic ideas in terms of the Islamic perspective on history, and make that comparison with a secular perspective, and particularly the Orientalist perspective coming out of Western scholarship. So what is the definition of the Isnad? The Isnad is the chain of narrators used to support the transmission of a particular narration, or what we call the matan. So every hadith has to have an Isnad and a matan, a chain of narrators of the people who transmitted the information, and then the narration or that information itself. The Isnad is the means by which a narration is traced back to the one who originally said or did something. So, for example, when you read in Sahih Bukhari, he's going to say that he heard from so-and-so, his teacher who heard from so-and-so, his teacher who heard from so-and-so, and it's going to go all the way back to the Sahaba, to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So the Isnad is this transmission of, recording the transmission of the narration. Now, usually when we talk about the hadith, it commonly refers to what Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said or did. But the Isnad system, the use of the Isnad, is pervasive throughout the early period. This is how all information was passed on. Historical information, information about later battles, information about establishment of the Islamic Caliphate, the Islamic government, anything that was happening. And we'll take a look at some of these in the historical context. But anything that the Sahaba were doing, this information gets passed down through an Isnad system. Now, in some cases, the Isnad system is very rigorous, in terms of being minutely accurate about the transmission, and this is in reference to anything that Muhammad ﷺ said or did. Other times, the Isnad system is a little bit weaker in terms of sort of a laxity related to who's doing the transmitting, if that chain of narrators sometimes is broken or not completely reported. So there's different levels of understanding in terms of how do we determine accuracy, with the most rigorous attention to accuracy given to reports from Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and then more of a sliding scale, as we'll see, in terms of reporting other issues. Also, the Isnad system, as I said, then is used in a variety of contexts, in which one wants to establish the validity of a report, such as in the transmission of information about these historical events. But here the important thing is that in the 1st century of Islam, the 2nd century of Islam, even going into 3rd century of Islam, the Isnad system is how information is reported. From eyewitnesses, passed on to another generation, passed on to another generation. And so the question is going to become, how do we know how accurate any of this information is? All right, a quick look at the linguistic meaning of the word Isnad. It does come from a verb, either sanada yasnudu or sanida yasnudu, which means simply to lean or rest on something. Because the Isnad is going to be that thing in which the narration leans or rests. So it's going to be the support that's holding up the narration. Okay. There's another verb, asnada, or yusnidu. It has a similar meaning. And from these verbs, of course, within the context of the Arabic language, you have two nouns that are used, sanad, and it's plural asnad, or the word isnad, and it's plural asanid. Okay. And both of them are used. You will hear or read scholars saying the sanad of the narration or the isnad of the narration. Although generally isnad has a little bit more popularity, you might say. So linguistically, the word isnad simply means the support that's holding up a narration. Okay. Now, in relation to the hadith, the meaning is to trace, ascribe, or attribute a tradition or report to its author, and this would be Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, by mentioning without interruption the persons who transmitted it from him. So this is going to be a core issue that we'll get into detail later on, is that you have to have an unbroken chain of narrators. You can't be skipping around. You can't have unknown people in there. You can't just say, I heard from so-and-so. You have to have specific names. You have to know who these people are that are transmitting the information. Right? Now you have other terms that are used for the hadith, right, or for the transmission of knowledge. Another common term is khabar, right, and it's plural akhbar. So very often some scholars will simply refer, instead of saying the word hadith, they will say khabar. Right? And here they're meaning the same basic thing. So the use of the word khabar could refer to information going back to Prophet Muhammad, right? Or it could refer to information about the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. Right? You have a third term that's used, and this is athar, and it's plural athar. Right? And this most likely or most common is used only for the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. So something that a Sahaba said or did, or one of the Tabi'un said or did, and most scholars will refer to this as the athar. Right? Although sometimes you will see athar used in relation to the hadith going back to Prophet Muhammad. So anyway, this is looking at that linguistic meaning.